All right, what's up, tech haberdashery fans and just kind of tech enthusiasts in general, I guess. I said in my last video that I was going to bring you some benchmarks for the Sonnet B350 with the RX-480 inside, and so we're just going to run through those real quick. I will say a couple things up front. There are several games where the Intel integrated graphics just completely made the game unplayable altogether. For which I just didn't even bother writing down benchmarks for, because really it's like, why? You know, if you're getting like 2-3 frames per second, there's really no point in it at all. Also, QuickTime sucks for game recording. Just up front, it all comes out looking very choppy. I don't have anything else to record it with on my Mac, so it's not good. But up in the upper corner, you'll see the frame rate counter, so look at that and that'll tell you what the actual gameplay experience is like. So don't pay attention to the video because the video is not very smooth. That being said, if you, with the QuickTime recording off, generally my game capture for the frame rates for it was, according to the Steam frame rate marking at least, was generally 3 to 4 frames faster. Even on the Intel graphics, if a game didn't run very well at all, you know, if it's pulling 9 frames per second at the high end, it's like, there's just not even a point. So, short version is, game performance is way, way, way up with the external graphics card. I might have to get me a newer Mac, something that has Thunderbolt 3 on it, to see what this card can really do, because being reduced down to Thunderbolt 1 speeds, it's much better than what's built in, but it's not nearly as good as it could be. So without further ado, we shall get to some graphics benchmarks. Okay, the first video we've got here is just a recording of the Maxon Cinebench 3D, and I'm first going to show you the AMD Radeon RX-480, and then I will be showing you the Intel HD graphics. Honestly, it's no comparison at all with the Radeon putting in close to 3 times the performance score of the Intel graphics. And here's a side-by-side screenshot of the scores. What I find interesting is how much worse the Radeon RX-480 scores in comparison to the GT650. Now, my assumption is that the GT650 is from an integrated, dedicated card inside an actual MacBook Pro or something to that effect. And if you actually look up just a few there, you'll see a GTX 460. So that's interesting. I'm assuming that all of these are running on OS X, that you're comparing it to other OS X cards and not anything in Windows. Of course, if these are in Windows, that would also explain the significant graphical difference in terms of raw performance. Sid Meier's Civilization 5 was interesting and kind of shows what the card is really capable of. At 1080p on medium settings, the game consistently stays above 30 frames per second, but doesn't ever quite break 60. Still, it's consistently smooth, even though it only ever really gets into the upper 50s. I think I saw 57 at the highest, and that was on a fairly zoomed out view of the world. If you zoom in and start getting some details, that transition from out to in really takes its toll on the card. As far as the Intel graphics goes, I was forced to play at 1024 by 768 on all low settings. Even then, there's a considerable frame rate spike into single digits. I guess I wouldn't call it a spike. It's really I guess you'd call it a spike downward, but it's a pretty sharp drop. Starting with Civilization 6, the story between the different games gets pretty similar. Civilization 6 with the RX-480, it was playable at 1080p, but it's not readily enjoyable. I did a small map with just one AI, and the game never really got past 30 frames per second, and that was on low settings. So leaves a lot to be desired. With the Intel HD 4000, as I said at the beginning of the video, it becomes pretty much unplayable, so I didn't even really bother grabbing any video for it. Metro Last Light was a mixed bag. The indoor and underground elements of the game run pretty well, even getting into the low 60s in these small confined rooms. Smoke effects, however, will bring the game to its knees, as do the large outdoor landscapes, which aren't terribly often, fortunately for that. But when they do come around, the performance is so poor it is pretty much unplayable. Those with motion sickness, beware. I'm not very prone to motion sickness, and I got a little queasy at how the game stuttered so rapidly between okay frame rates and then dragging across the ground when it came to the score. So unfortunately at 1080p the graphics need to be turned all the way down to approach a playable frame rate, so keep that in mind. Alright, next is Dawn of War 3. Just for the sake of a little transparency here, I was not able to do a screen capture from the game and play it at the same time. My entire Mac would crash, which appears to be the same issue as the Unigine Valley. That's why I don't have any benchmarks for Unigine Valley. As soon as I ran a benchmark, it would crash. So for the sake of transparency and fairness, what I've done is I've recorded the benchmark on my PC and set the same graphics settings. So be aware what you're seeing is the PC footage, but in terms of actual graphical fidelity, this is what you can expect the game to look like. The low score is a bit deceptive, as the benchmark starts off at 1 or 2 frames per second for several seconds before actually kicking off and getting going. This behavior is the same on my Windows computer, so the accuracy is a bit skewed. All of that said, once the initial phase of the benchmark is passed, the 32 frames per second average seems pretty accurate. The lowest I saw in the Steam FPS counter was at about 32. Actually, that's the lowest I visually saw it drop. Otherwise, it was pretty consistently in the low 40s. Occasionally, it would peak up for a few seconds above that, sometimes into the 50s. Obviously, it hit its highest point at 72 frames per second. Finally, we have Alien Isolation, which plays pretty poorly, and I suspect that's due to the lighting effect. If anything, the QuickTime capture I did here is not misleading, because this is pretty well what the game looks like in terms of actual choppiness that you're seeing. I did everything I could without dropping the graphics all the way to down. I turned off chromatic aberration, depth of field, ambient occlusion, etc. I mean, anything that I could think of that affects the lighting, and still the performance at 1080p is pretty subpar. So maybe knocking this down to 720p produces something a little more playable. Lastly, I recorded some footage for Deus Ex Human Revolution. With the RX-480 indoors, you can expect the low 30s, mid 30s, with some jumps into the 40s and 50s during conversations. Outdoors, you can expect it to drop into the teens even during conversations, and it's not going to be very good. When it comes to running on the Intel graphics, I could get it running, but I would have to drop it down to 1024 by 768 and all of the lowest settings. Even then, it's not terribly playable, being roughly in the mid-teens the whole time. Okay, everybody, that's my benchmarking for the RX-480 and the Sonnet B350. It'll make your games playable at roughly medium settings at 1080p, but I wouldn't go expecting the world. It gets, well, not great the higher up the scale you go. So for a really smooth experience, you may actually want to look at doing 1080p at the lowest settings. Sometimes it doesn't make much of a difference. Also keep in mind that this is an old Mac, and you're converting Thunderbolt 3 to Thunderbolt 1. So there's going to be a significant performance hit with that. Otherwise, I hope you found this useful. Comments, questions below, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.